Let's talk about music elements and how they apply to our song. Most of our songs are going to be riff based. A riff is a short repeating pattern of notes which are perfect for loops. In fact, what a loop usually is a short repeating pattern of notes. When I start my song, here's a riff right here. It lasts 2 bars. And we expect it to keep going while we bring in the new idea. This disappears into the subconscious. A riff is the same thing as a beat in the drums, but it's on pitched instruments, not on percussion instruments. The second element that I'm introducing from this list right here is a break. And I do that break right here by thinning. Remember, we talked about that previously. By opening up spaces in here, we grab the listener's attention or create a sense of suspension. So I have breaks in between each one of these riffs. I'm shortening that riff. I also have a major break here as I move into the chorus. So let me just play that break for you here. Gap. Okay. And right here, 15, you'll hear the break right at the end. Right here. Break. Just before the chorus, a short break. Okay. So breaks are really good at catching the listener's attention, creating a sense of suspension that then you can release with the reintroduction of the old idea or a new idea. We create a sense of release into the chorus here when we bring back the sounds after that quick pause. I introduce another riff right here, so I have 2 riffs going. And I can see the riffs. I can see the short notes, and I can see the repetitive nature. Okay, I can see that that is very different than when I look down at this effect, this fill effect here, or if I look over here at my lead part. Okay, these have different shapes in the patterns than the riff. The riff is going to have a lot of shorter notes that look something like this. I bring in a melody at measure 17 here, and that has a very different look to it. If you can see that there are some short notes, some long notes, and then some gaps. That's very indicative of a melody, and it looks much different than the riff down below, doesn't it? This is much more repetitive, shorter notes pretty consistently, mixture of short, long, and empty spaces. That's a sign of a melody. A melody sounds like this. Okay, so that's keeping our attention more than the riff, which just kind of keeps grooving in the background. Finally, we get to a fill, and I showed you that at measure 24. I have a fill in the drum part right here, which I emphasize by having a break in the upper parts and then filling in the extra notes, right? A little bit of ornamentation here to create that fill. Okay, so I'm using both a break and a fill simultaneously to create a sense of tension and drive towards the next measure. When we talked about bridges, we brought in the idea of a pad. Now, my pad doesn't look as pad-like as it sounds. It's kind of got these longer notes in it. Some pads will look much flatter like this. You see that? That's indicative of a pad right there. So anytime you see something really long like that, where the shape of the sound is very extended, it's probably a pad. Short like this, it's a riff, and a combination of those two is going to be a melody. Let's just listen to my pads, and you'll hear how they're more just long-held notes. They go for about half a measure. Now there's no combination of shorter notes. There's no short repeating pattern. So this becomes a pad. Especially this note right here, right? Pads are long held notes. Now we don't have pedals as much. We don't use those as much as music back in the 80s maybe did. And so I'm not worried about you finding a pedal, although I want you to be able to hear that. So as you go through your track, I want you to be able to identify these things, what measure it is in, and what part it's in. So you'd say something like, hey, in measure 1, I have a riff going in the bass part. At measure 65, I have a pad going in the accompaniment part. Lastly, I want you to be able to indicate where you are using counterpoint. And counterpoint, you've probably already started to naturally do it, but if you remember, it's to have some instruments playing when others aren't. The idea of counterpoint is you're kind of passing the baton between multiple instruments. We can look at it at a macro or a micro level. The micro level, when I started my song right here, I had that big gap in the bass part, and the first thing I thought was, when I bring in my accompaniment, I probably want it to fill in that gap right there. I also created a gap in the accompaniment part to make space for a couple notes in the bass part. If you listen here, they're passing the baton between the two. Now you don't want it to be too extreme. It starts to sound silly if you do something like, let's say this. If we have too much counterpoint, it starts to sound herky and jerky. Hear that? The right amount is generally somewhere around, you have 2/3 of the time they're playing at the same time, and maybe at most 1/3 of the time they're playing at opposite times. So I've got a couple notes in the bass down here playing when there's nothing in the accompaniment, and I've got a couple notes in the accompaniment playing when there's nothing in the bass. This is micro counterpoint. Macro counterpoint looks more like this that I have in my second verse here, which is where I'm going entire measures with one sound and then switching over to another. So what I'm doing here is I have the accompaniment riff playing, and then I'm going to stop it and hand the baton over to the bass riff and the drums, and then I'm going to bring back the accompaniment riff here. Macro accompaniment is at the larger scale. And then I'm going to hand it off. But someone's got to keep the song moving forward, right? That's a pretty dramatic switch there. And then I bring it back. Macro and micro counterpoint. And the idea in both is that you are passing the baton between more than one of your parts. So for my track, I would say I have counterpoint between my accompaniment and bass parts in measures 5 through 7. And I would indicate that right here. That's it for counterpoint. Go on over to the bridge video if you want to learn more about how to do the bridge part of this assignment.